Hi, this is Jeff Curto, and welcome to episode 59 of Camera Position, a podcast about the creative side of photography. Well, did you miss me? I missed you too, and I am glad to be back making Camera Position again. I have had the wildest, woolliest fall I think I've ever had, just an enormous amount of activity, and almost all of it, thankfully, centered around photography. So here I am on Thanksgiving Day in front of the microphone and happy to be back. This particular episode, what I'd like to do is share with you some of the activity that I did do during the fall. And one of those things is the topic of today's Camera Position, and that is a presentation that I made to the Midwest Society for Photographic Education Conference in Flint, Michigan. Flint, the University of Michigan campus at Flint, and the Midwest Society for Photographic Education Regional Conference was held there a couple of weeks ago, and I was pleased to have been asked to present my work and talk about my photographs at an image maker session during the conference. And so what I'd like to do is present to you that audio as well as the slideshow that I made to go along with my presentation. You'll note a reference early on to another slideshow, and what I did is threw a whole bunch of images up on the screen of some of the work that I have done over the last 17 years, 18 years in Italy. And so if you're interested in taking a look at those images, I'll place a link on the cameraposition.com blog page that will take you to my website where you can take a look at a larger quantity of the work that is contained inside the slideshow. But the majority of what you'll hear now is the presentation that I made on November the 10th at the Midwest Society for Photographic Education Conference at the University of Michigan, Flint. So here we are joining that presentation.
Well, thanks for coming this morning, early, bright and early, hopefully somewhat caffeinated. My name is Jeff Curto, and I'm a full-time faculty member at College of DuPage, a community college outside of Chicago that you probably haven't ever heard of, but we're about 30,000 students strong, and fairly large photography department, which I chair. And I'm glad that you're here to hear me talk a little bit about this project I've been working on for quite a long time that I call the Italian Portfolio Evidence of Hands on Stone. And what I'm going to do this morning is kind of this sort of thing. I have a sort of a quick slideshow kind of thing to introduce you to a bunch of the work so that you can see a lot of it all at once. And then I'll sort of give you a quick overview of where I've been and what I'm doing and how I've gotten to where I am. And then we'll look at some specific images and have plenty of time at the end to chat about stuff. Since 1989, I've been photographing the architectural landscape of Italy, exploring the visual splendor of religious public vernacular structures. And the objects, in my mind, are evidence of the patient application of hands on stone. The idea that ordinary people have taken ordinary materials and created something fairly extraordinary out of them. And it's also interesting to me that there are these layers of these objects that have accumulated certain aspects of a cultural construct over time as well. So my photographs are in response to this subtle layering of the ancient and the everyday, of things that came at various points in the history of these objects. So what I wanted to do is just share with you a little bit about the work, and we'll just sort of go through this set. So I wanted to toss a bunch of images at you real quick and just sort of give you a sense of the overall body of the work. I mean, as you might imagine, a body of work I've been working on since 1989. I have a lot of photographs, so the ability to kind of get a bunch of things out there all at once is interesting to me anyway. I think to help you get a sense of what's up there. I love this Robert Adams quote: "At our best and most fortunate, we make pictures because of what stands in front of the camera to honor what is greater and more interesting than we are. We never accomplish this perfectly, though in return we are given something perfect, a sense of inclusion. Our subject thus redefines us and is part of the biography by which we want to be known. And I really don't know of a more succinct description of what it is that I'm trying to do and what my photographs are about than this piece from this outstanding collection of essays that Adams wrote about photography, Why People Photograph. Because it really kind of looks at the idea of how what we do of making photographs of places and things ends up enriching us in some way. And while the eventual image in all its finished glory interests me to some degree, it's the act of making photographs that I find the greatest pleasure in. And for me, it's that joy of discovery, the joy of discovering where I am, what I'm doing, and that essential experience of what stands before the camera. My path, as I've already sort of defined it, in '89, I started making photographs in Italy, and my first response, as just about anybody who goes to a culture that has so much beauty in it, my first response was to make what I thought of ultimately as pretty pictures. And eventually that response over a 16-visit experience has changed into an expression of the vernacular expression of man through structure. And I've really found that the Italian structure is of the land. It's of the place where it's built. It's very much unlike the way in which we build here in the United States in terms of how we look at the way in which we put structure in the landscape. Their response has always seemingly been to deal with the structure as part of the landscape in a way. And my interest ultimately turned to what it was that people were doing with their hands in making these buildings, making these structures. Looking back, I'm certain that it's this combination of powerful subject and powerful experience that brought me back again and again to Italy. People ask me oftentimes, why do you keep going back to Italy? Why don't you go to these other places? This place is also beautiful. And I think, certainly I have an appreciation for the culture. I like every aspect of the culture. I mean, I like the food, I like the wine, I like the people. I know some of the language, but I really also know of no other place where there is a sense of importance of history that's intermingled with the everyday. People in Italy really seem to get the fact that they are living amongst history all the time, and that they have this sense that they walk on something that is 1,000 years old every day as they walk to their place of employment. So the other part that I've always found really interesting in these visits I've made to this country is the way in which people have this sense of kind of protection and caretaking of this stuff that they've inherited from ancestors long ago past. And they are extremely often, most of the times, I think, extremely careful custodians of that. And in some ways, that's really remarkable, but it's even more remarkable when you look at the length of time that they're dealing with. Caretaking of 3,000 years of history is pretty remarkable, and it's a pretty powerful thing, and a task not to be taken lightly. So I also thought it would be useful for you to know a little bit about the process. I've been working with a large format camera, a 4x5, on all of these photographs, and obviously in '89 when I started doing this, there was no digital photography. I mean, there was, but not anything that the standard issue person would be able to access and use. But I've continued to shoot with the 4x5 camera. I've continued to shoot with black and white film. Now I'm scanning those negatives on a large format scanner and making inkjet prints. But the camera continues to be a sort of essential element for me. The experience of the view camera in a variety of ways. There are a number of things about the camera that are really important to me. One is that it slows me down, forces me to look at what it is that I really want to look at. A big day is, 15, 16 photographs, so that's part of it. Another part of it is that by using the large format camera, I become somebody different in the eyes of the people who are watching me make these photographs. And while the pictures are not populated, there are often lots and lots of people around me while I'm doing things. And there's something for me about the placing of that hood over my head that kind of shuts me out from the rest of the world and allows me to just concentrate on what it is that I'm seeing. It took me a while to figure this out, but I ultimately discovered throughout my life that I have this ADD thing, right? So putting the hood over my head really helps me kind of focus myself in a way that I'm not otherwise able to. The distractions of the outside world really kind of go away with that. So the last piece is about the large format camera that I think is important, is that because the large format camera is so different from what most people see, there is a real sense that I get from other people about their understanding of the significance of what I'm doing. In other words, they really see me as being different from the standard issue photographer holding a camera up to their face every few seconds. And that has ended up gaining me entrance to all kinds of interesting and wonderful places. I've met tons and tons and tons of people. I've made a number of really interesting friends just through the use of this camera and the conversations that it engenders. So that has been interesting to me. Another quotation that I thought was sort of relevant here is Zarkowski. Way back in '67, most of those who were called documentary photographers a generation ago when the label was new made their pictures in the service of a social cause. It was their aim to show what was wrong with the world and persuade their fellows to take action and make it right. In the past decade, a new generation of photographers has directed the documentary approach toward more personal ends. Their aim has not been to reform life, but to know it. And Zarkowski is really talking about those sort of new documentarians of the late 60s, but in fact, I think that tradition has really been carried through to a lot of photographers, and I think I would count myself among them. The idea that the documentary approach is aimed at this more personal strategy, and knowing myself is an important part of it. So I thought I'd spend a few minutes telling you about a few of these images to give you a sense of where we are and what they are, and a little bit about the objects and the places themselves, because one of the things that I discovered is as I became more and more interested in structure, now obviously with a background like most of us have all had, I'd taken my art history licks, I'd done all of the architectural and art history stuff, but I've really learned a lot more about the architecture of these eras that I'm most interested in because of the research that I've done about them. So this is an absolutely wonderful church outside the walls of a Tuscan town, an Italian town called Montepulciano. And it's San Biaggio, a temple actually. It's called the Tempio Di San Biaggio, designed by Antonio di Sangallo the Younger, who was a student of Bramante, the great architect. And this was built between 1518 and 1545. The entire outside of the structure is built of this beautiful white travertine marble. And travertine is this substance that has this astonishing texture to it, and it isn't the sort of marble that we think of when we think of this sort of polished surface. It's a very different kind of a textural quality to the surface, and the idea here is that this is essentially a Renaissance building, but as the Renaissance waned, architects began to explore this variety of different ways to kind of enliven the surface. And one of the ways was to come up with this, I meant to get out my little laser pointer, but this pilaster that runs the entire facade from the bottom to the top, which was generally accredited to being invented by Michelangelo, called the giant order, a giant pilaster that goes from the bottom to the top. The southern area of what is now the city of Matera in Basilicata, and if you can imagine the peninsula of Italy, Basilicata is kind of at the arch of the boot. The area of Matera has been settled since the Paleolithic era. This is an amazing place. It's certainly one of the most interesting places I've ever been in the world, and certainly one of the most interesting places I've ever been in Italy. Ancient troglodyte cultures carved out caves out of some soft tufa stone and literally lived inside the caves. And people lived inside the caves from prehistoric times all the way through the 1950s. And they lived in these caves with no running water. They lived in caves with no electricity all the way through the 1950s until the Italian government got kind of embarrassed. A series of things occurred. The Italian government became embarrassed that there were people living in these generally squalid conditions, as they had for thousands and thousands of years, and they ultimately kind of relocated all these people into new housing in a more modern part of the city that had grown up nearby. And what happened was that Matera, the city itself, kind of fell into a kind of ghost town from the 50s through really about the 1990s. In 93, Matera was named a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And once it was named a World Heritage Site, people began to relocate back inside of these buildings. And the idea of being able to now re-inhabit these caves that had literally been carved into the side of hillsides. And then once they had carved into the sides of the hillsides, they would then take blocks of this material, this soft tufa stone, and build structures in addition to just carving in. But the city had been occupied by this series of tribes and cultures: the Saracens, the Byzantines, the Normans, the Aragons. I mean, it was just absolutely this endless stream of cultures. And the idea of being able to live in a place that was inhabited by ancestors 3,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago, is pretty remarkable. And it's an area that's become known as the Sassi di Matera, which literally kind of translates to stones, the stones of Matera. And one of the remarkable things about Matera is the churches. There are something on the order of 100 stone or rock churches that have literally been carved out of the faces of these soft stone cliffs. And some people believe that these are some of the oldest Christian churches in the world. And the idea that what happened was initially the churches were literally carved out of the cliffs, and eventually facades were created. And the facades that were created with the architectural styling of the era in which they were made. So, and this is not a particularly large area. I mean, it's not a particularly huge town. And the idea that there are 100 of these stone churches in it is pretty remarkable. Time is really one of my essential ideas here. Our lives are governed by it. We understand stuff like when we're supposed to go to sleep and when we're supposed to wake up and when we're supposed to eat and all those kinds of things. We understand that because our body clock kind of tells us that. And we understand the idea of spending too much time in one place or on one subject. We also understand the sort of frustration that comes with the notion of not having enough time on a subject, when we really want to spend more time, but something pulls us away, some other obligation or need in our lives. And at midlife, I think I'm becoming more and more aware of time and the construct of time and the constraints of time and the issues that time deal with in our lives. And I think I understand time a lot better at 48 years of age than I did in my 20s or even in my 30s. That time really has become this sort of measure of who I am and how much time I have to devote to things. So while my pictures are not populated with people and their sort of response to to the environment that I'm looking at. It's my hope that the photographs resonate with the presence of these centuries of people who have passed through those spaces. This is a wonderful church, La Collegiata, in a Tuscan town called San Quirico di Orcia. So it's La Collegiata di San Quirico. And San Quirico is a city in sort of south-central Tuscany. It's built, the church was built mostly in the 11th and 12th centuries of both sandstone and travertine marble. And it's a terrific example of the mix of the simplicity of Romanesque with a bit more sort of embellishment of that Gothic style. Friezes of these dueling fantasy animals. I guess you can see those. I was wondering how the projector would be bright enough. These wonderful dueling fantasy animals up at on the lintel above the door. Then lions that hold up these four slendered columns that are knotted. And I've been spending some time trying to find out more about this knotted column structure, and really haven't been able to come up with much other than that it comes from Gaelic cultures. And so the idea of the intermingling of things, we tend to think of these things as sort of all being of a singular culture, and in fact, there are these world influences, even at a time when communication wasn't nearly as prevalent as it is now. A fountain in the Trastevere region of Rome, one of Rome's wonderful neighborhoods, and this was just these things really are the things that I begin to think about. Think about, well, where did this fountain come from, and how was it made, and what's the sort of history of this particular object? It's the oldest monumental fountain in Rome. It was built initially in 780 AD under Pope Adriano I, and it was for many years the only source of water in this particular section of Rome. So it was where everyone came to get their water. It was fed by aqueducts, the famous Roman aqueducts that came from up in the hills. But what's interesting is how many changes that the fountain underwent. Donato Bramante in 1498, under the order of Pope Alessandro VI Borgia, redid the fountain. Then in 1659, Bernini, San Lorenzo Bernini, restored the fountain by taking it apart, literally piece by piece, and moving it from the facade of the church, which is where it was, right underneath the sort of main face of the church in the piazza, out into the center of the piazza, and then rebuilt it exactly as it was. So while it's Bernini doing it, it's Bernini doing it to sort of redo what Bramante had done in 1498. And then in 1692, Carlo Fontana restored it again, this time enlarging the basin so that there was a greater quantity of water. Obviously, the population was growing, and then moving these ornamental kind of shell shapes that flank each one of the corners of this octagonal fountain, moving them to point inward instead of outward. And then in 1873, the Commune of Rome rebuilt the entire fountain in gray marble, but kept Fontana's design intact. So here is this layering of time. This idea that this thing was built in the 1st century, and that over time, people embellished it, altered it, changed it, and here it is, still one of the most important monumental fountains of Rome. And this gets me to this idea that Italian history is palpable. It is something you feel, you touch, you walk on it. I mean, every time you turn a corner, you're walking on something or touching something that has been there for this extended period of time. And so there's this reassuring sense of place and continuity that comes with every Italian's casual coexistence with antiquity. This is a portion of the facade of a cathedral in Orvieto, an Umbrian hill town, a Gothic cathedral, or Duomo, as cathedrals, the bigger cathedrals are known. Construction began in 1290. And this is a detail of these magnificent spiral columns that grace the facade of the church, that are flanked by these acanthus-leaved secondary or tertiary columns. The Duomo's design has often been attributed to Arnolfo di Cambio. I love that name, Arnolfo di Cambio. Cambio is to change, Arnolfo the changer. I think that the idea of somebody named Arnolfo the Changer. But the modern opinion, the prevailing modern opinion about what this structure is that its master mason was an obscure monk named Fra Bevignate from Perugia. So initially, the idea was that the structure was attributed to a well-known architect. But ultimately, people have discovered, the historians have discovered, that it wasn't a well-known architect. It's just this sort of guy who nobody really knew about. And that brings me to this idea that the monuments, both great and small, that we associate with this marvelous Italian peninsula, are indicative of the power of its past glories, but also a testament to the people who tend to invest all that they do with a degree of importance that transcends rank. And that transcends station. So what we're looking at is a structure that in one way is one of the most magnificent Gothic cathedral structures of its time, of its place, but the idea that it may have been made by somebody who is relatively unknown is also, I think, fairly significant. This is the portal, the door of this amazing place. Those places you go to in your life, where you somehow connect with the place in a way that you can't really describe or understand, like you've been there before, but even if you haven't been there before, and this is one of them for me. San Antimo is a stunning monastery in a sort of a valley in rural Tuscany, not too far from Montepulciano, not too far from Montalcino. It's sort of kind of in the middle in some ways of nowhere. A very tranquil valley it holds it. It's generally regarded as one of the finest Romanesque religious buildings in all of Italy. And it's made out of really three primary materials: travertine marble, which we've talked about already, but also alabaster and onyx. So the church has this sort of combination of materials that make it quite remarkable. The columns inside the church are made of, at least in part, alabaster, and when light comes into the church, it is an extraordinary experience that I have found to be unphotographable in terms of recording what it feels like, but the idea of this light really reflecting off of these reflective materials, reflective and translucent materials, is pretty remarkable. So traces of various building details date from the 9th through the 12th centuries. One of the things that that we find is when we look at construction projects here, it might take 6 months, it might take a year, it might take 18 months, but some of these buildings were worked on over a long period of time, and from the 9th through the 12th centuries, and yet here is this building that has this remarkably long history and is regarded as this sort of astonishingly beautiful and perfect Romanesque structure, and yet it's still in use. Monks live in a building next door. They still chant the Mass in Latin every day, and that in itself is a pretty remarkable experience to be in the church when they're doing that. And the interest in making something extraordinary from the everyday is a tradition that's been passed down over millennia, and it remains an integral part of Italian life. And these multiple fragments of the past come together with elements of current life to create this sort of new thing, which I find remarkable. This is the same building, sort of on the back side of the building, and the sculptures in San Antimo are of extraordinary quality. They are quite beautiful in and of themselves. And the building itself, both in terms of plan and detailing, has a strong French or Lombard influence to it. And because of that, the building contains a lot of motifs that are found throughout the Roman world. foliage, the Mediterranean influence, geometric forms, and Irish Gaelic influence, biblical or mythological animals, the Byzantine influence. And there's some suggestion that historians that two workshops worked on this structure to create the architectural detailing. And the idea that one of them may have been in France and the other in Italy, and that ultimately what we get is this sort of combination of cultural constructs kind of coming together. This is the town of Ascoli Piceno. Ascoli Piceno is in the province of the Marches, or Le Marche, little known, little traveled province on the eastern coast of Italy, south of Venice. So it's a thin strip that occupies a primarily coastal area, but also with some mountain towns. And this travertine structure was the seat of the government for the town of Ascoli Piceno. Palace of the Captains is what it is. It's the Palazzo di Capitani, the Palace of the Captains. And it's interesting in that it's a structure that was built primarily as a sort of a seat, a place for a locally elected group of officials to meet. And in a time that we think of as sort of one ruling family, this was a democracy of elected people, really not only from the guilds and the trades, but really from all walks of life. The clock was added in the 1500s, and Tony and I were talking about this last night when we were looking at this in the gallery, and it's interesting to note that clocks with Roman numerals, has anybody ever noticed this before, that clocks with Roman numerals often have the number 4 as 4 ones as opposed to a 1 and a 5? And once I discovered this with the help of my teenage son, who kept looking at it and saying, "That clock's wrong, Dad. It's supposed to have a 4 there." I've done some research and found that this has been going on throughout the centuries as clocks began to be changed to Roman numerals, or that Roman numerals were employed on clocks is probably the best way to say it, that the 4 was 4 ones. And that part I think is really odd, and maybe not odd exactly, but if you think about it from a design point of view, the 4 ones balance off the 8 a little bit better. And if you think about it from a pragmatic point of view, if you were to put a traditional Roman numeral 4 there might be confusion between the 4 and the 6. So there are a ton of opinions about why this occurred this way, but I find it really interesting. And this building, which was built in the 1400s with a clock added in the 1500s, modification of that structure. Modification is an important element in the way in which I look at how centuries and centuries of human handiwork has altered nearly every square inch of the landscape of the Italian peninsula. Ultimately, over time, I began to recognize that it wasn't just the built environment, the structural environment, houses and buildings and churches and things, that were modified, but that vineyards and olive groves and everything else was modified. And looking out at that tranquil landscape that we imagine in our mind's eye when we think of Italy, and we think, wow, how beautiful and untouched, especially relative to our landscape, which is often quite heavily touched. And then we begin to realize that that land has been farmed for this extended period of time. And the idea of changing one's surroundings for the benefit of man suggests some sort of ethical position, which I think is really interesting. Also in Ascoli Piceno, inside the Palazzo Capitani, and the idea of this light kind of strikingly beautiful through this aperture way up high in a kind of a courtyard inside of a building. And one of the things that I find interesting is this continuous search for that nebulous quality of beauty. And I'm really excited to listen to this panel discussion later today about the conundrum of beauty, because I think it's one of the problems that, certainly one of the problems that I deal with in my work. It's beautiful. I intend it to be beautiful. I'm hoping for it to be beautiful, and yet there seems to be this sort of opposition to that in much of photography. And for me, when I'm looking at these places, I look at that quality of beauty in repurposing the place from what was there to what it is that is wanted. How do we want this to look? And how do we want to enhance our lives in some way? And then lastly, this last image, Artesia is the historical heart of Syracuse, or Syracusa, in Sicily. And Sicily is really remarkable in that there is so much Greek in the Italian culture in Sicily. There are Greek temples, there are Greek names, there are people who speak languages that are sort of a patois of Greek and Italian. So it's a really remarkable place in many ways. And this is inside the portico of the Cathedral in Artesia, which is actually, Artesia is sort of like a little island off the coast of Syracuse, and was kind of a defensive place. That's what it was primarily, its primary function was defensive. And I really just was struck by the light that was coming through this sort of grate or aperture a grated aperture that caressed this column. And the column itself, that spiral design and the grape motif that's on it, all of that stuff really attracted me to it. So at first, in these photographs, it was the stuff that interested me, the buildings, the structures, the sculptures, but ultimately it was the people who made these things and consciously took them and made them look like what they are today. So the people are those intermediary agents who transform that space from ordinary to extraordinary, and it's their hands that shape and sculpt and craft that existing environment in a significant way. And so it's really, for me, not just the object, but the effect of those hands over time on the object that really tremendously attract me.
Well, there was the body of my presentation from the Midwest Society for Photographic Education conference in Flint, Michigan, just a few weeks ago. And I hope you found that monologue, really, about the work that I've been doing, at least a little bit different from what we've talked about on camera position before. Quite a bit more depth of information about the buildings and about the places that I go. And again, the idea that bringing a depth of information to the project that you're working on can be a real important part about not only your involvement in the project, but also bringing other people into your project who may or may not have a particular interest in photography, but may have an interest in other kinds of areas as well. So there we have it, and I will, over this next few weeks, I have some great ideas for some camera position episodes. Got some of them actually already completed, so hopefully we'll see a bit more frequency in release of these episodes of Camera Position, the podcast about the creative side of photography. Thanks for joining me. Camera Position is a proud member of the Photocast Network, your photo resource in the potosphere. photocastnetwork.com